following program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.
Welcome to Speak Up. I'm Kevin Avard, your host. And today we're going to be talking about the death penalty. And I titled this show called The Death Penalty on Trial. Most of you who know me know that I've always been a proponent of the death penalty. I've always thought that it was a commandment that was handed down biblically. I thought as a state senator, as a state representative, that is a legal obligation to make sure that justice is served. But as time goes on and we look at our justice system, things call into question whether we can have faith in our justice system to carry out this form of justice. So today I have a very special guest. They call him Br.Dale. He is a layman working with the Catholic Diocese, and your last name is Recinella.
Dale Recinella, yes.
Dale Recinella. Thank you for coming on the show, and I really appreciate it.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
Dale, we've had, I have some people in my district, that I totally respect, who have they have a horror of the death penalty. All my life growing up as Catholic, then, later on I converted to Baptist, and I do believe in biblical principles. And I wanted to get into talking a little bit about that, how the foundation for me, how I came to my convictions. But as time goes on, as I see, I had interviewed an individual in my office at the Senate, Randy Steidel.
Yes.
Yeah, he was on death row for over 20 years. And I'd loved him to come on the show at some point to talk about his story. But there was a man that was on death row who was innocent. And he was a victim of the mob, in my opinion. And that mob had the right people in the right places, and one was a prosecutor. That was a weird way of holding somebody in a position to keep them quiet. It's a way to shut somebody up. You put them on death row. You falsely accuse them. That's not justice. And I really have a problem with that scenario happening, and overzealous prosecutors. I visited people in prison many times. I used to go there and sing to them and preach to them when I was a younger guy. And they're human beings. Some people made some bad choices, and some people made some heinous choices. And of course, you have personal experience with some of these people as well. You have a ministry, correct?
Yes, I represent the Catholic Church in Florida for cell-to-cell ministry on Florida's death row. So I know all the men on Florida's death row by name.
Interesting. And just before we went on camera, you told me that you actually witnessed at one point a man that you really truly believed was innocent.
Yeah, being executed,
Being
yes.
executed.
Yes. Like you, Kevin, I once supported the death penalty. And I also quoted a couple of scriptures. I'm Catholic. We didn't get into the scriptures as much as I have as an adult. But I knew life for life, eye for eye. But as I started studying the death penalty and started educating myself on what the American death penalty really provides, how it works, who gets it, I became very, very concerned that the realities of the death penalty in our country are nowhere near what's laid out in Scripture. And when I started looking into what the Scriptures require of the death penalty, I found out the absolute, rock bottom, utmost concern of the death penalty that's in the Bible is the command in Exodus 23:7, "Thou shalt not have any part in the execution of an innocent man." And of course, our death penalty is based on procedures.
In blind justice.
Blind justice. And so, yes, it's it's much too possible for someone who is innocent to find themselves on death row. It happens more often than people would imagine. And it's also very possible that, unlike in Randy's case, thank the Lord, that he was able to show his innocence and was released even after more than 20 years on death row. I mean, it's incomprehensible. But people who are innocent get executed. And I had a man that had asked me to be his spiritual advisor for his execution when his death warrant was signed. He told me he was innocent. I looked into his case. I found out that even judges in the appellate process were concerned he was innocent. One Florida Supreme Court judge just said this is unconscionable. But the procedural rules said it's been too long, we can't look at any new evidence. And so the evidence of his innocence was sitting in a locked box in a courthouse basement while I watched him being executed.
Okay, so let's, real quickly, where did these procedural rules come from?
The procedural rules are complicated because they're part of the common law. They're rules that make sense if people are in a lawsuit over money or over an estate or over a car accident. It says after a certain amount of time, whoever wins, wins, and whoever loses, loses, and that's it. Mm-hmm. It's called procedural bar. I never could have imagined that those rules are applied in cases where the state is trying to kill somebody.
Now, I know here in New Hampshire that the judicial branch makes their own rules. Did you know that?
Well, those are particular kinds of rules of procedure. These rules are part of the common law, which apply uniformly throughout the entire country. Because they've been incorporated at a federal level, at state levels, they become part of the death penalty legal structure. And the basic problem is that the death penalty in the United States is not concerned about factual innocence once you've been convicted and sentenced to death. The concern is about whether or not the procedures have been followed.
So they're trusting the lower courts or wherever the death penalty was, even if it was appealed all the way up to the Supreme Court, that the process has been exhausted. Now they're just talking about procedure.
It's procedure. And our U.S. Supreme Court in 1994 said the courts cannot be concerned with factual innocence on appeal. They can only be concerned with whether or not constitutionally required procedures were followed.
Okay.
I mean, who knows that? And then just recently, in 2006, our two most pro-death penalty Supreme Court justices, Antonin Scalia and Clarence Thomas, said in their opinions in Kansas v. Marsh, I'm paraphrasing them, of course you're going to execute innocent people. The only way not to execute innocent people is to not have the death penalty.
And of course that would be unbiblical, obviously. Right, that would be violation of the Levitical law, at least that was passed down back then, correct?
Well, that's a different question, because the question I started looking into is, yes, there's a death penalty in the Bible.
Right.
Okay. But how does it relate to what we've got? Mm-hmm. And I spent 5 years of extensive research into Judaica history, Torah, Talmud. What was the death penalty in the Bible when it was the law of the land? And I found out that there is absolutely nothing in common between the death penalty in the Bible and the death penalty that we have in the United States. The only thing in common is that at the end of the process, somebody gets executed. Mm-hmm. And so I came to the conclusion that while I fully support Scripture, and I consider Scripture to be God's revealed truth, what's in Scripture does not support the death penalty that we have in the United States. Mm-hmm. And so I do not feel that it in any way goes against Scripture to not support the death penalty that we have. That's the conclusion I came to.
Sure. Now, how long have you been doing this?
The work on death row?
Yeah.
17 years.
17 years. And how did you get involved with it?
What happened is my original career was in Wall Street finance as a lawyer.
Interesting.
And we had a wonderful career. I have a wonderful wife, 5 beautiful children, now a lot of grandchildren, with promises of more.
Congratulations. Same
God's
here.
blessed us abundantly, and you. But we came to a point in our life where we felt it was really important to start looking at ways to give back. And so my wife and I made ourselves available for volunteer ministry, and over a period of many years, that led to the church asking us to have me take responsibility for the church's ministry at Death Row in Florida. And so that was basically how we got there. And in that process, I experienced what I would call the death penalty up close. Because from a distance, and when you're in a state that hasn't had an execution since the 1930s, you really are at a distance from the real death penalty and how it affects human beings. From a distance, it can look like a solution. It can look like an answer. So what I try to do when I have the opportunity is to bring people into the things I've actually experienced, like witnessing the execution of a man I believe is innocent, so that they can come close to the reality through my experiences, which otherwise would be unavailable to them.
If you don't mind me keeping on the biblical path.
Sure.
You know, the first time we hear of the death penalty, obviously, is when Cain killed Abel.
Yes.
And in the Bible, it does say that God says that obviously he didn't kill Cain right then and there. He actually said if anybody does kill Cain, you know, there'll be a problem with that. However, though, that in the future, if man sheds man's blood, his blood shall be required, which basically was setting the tone before any kind of Levitical law or any type of direction. Obviously, then that went to who knows how that was carried out at that point after that. But that was the first command as a point of justice, because you're not supposed to take somebody's life.
Absolutely, we're not supposed to take somebody's life.
And prior to the law, there was the commandment of if you take somebody's life, your life shall be required. This is prior to Levitical law. In the New Testament, you only hear a reference, I believe, in the New Testament where that we're to obey the magistrates, and that the king does not bear the sword in vain, because it is therefore to punishment for the evildoers. And obviously the sword is a signal of death in most people's perspectives. I can understand not putting, obviously, the safeguards of not putting somebody to death that has the potential of being innocent if they're not proven to be, if it's circumstantial. But when you get into heinous crimes such as, where we had an incident here in New Hampshire where somebody, you know, a couple of kids went into somebody's house, raped the mother and the daughter, and then killed them. I mean, just brutally murdered them. And there really was, it was absolutely sure that they did it. How do you handle that?
Well, first I want to mention that in addition to caring for men on death row and my wife ministering to their families during the execution, because the families in Florida are not allowed to be there, we also minister to families of murder victims.
Yeah.
Not in capital cases, that would be a horrendous conflict. But in non-capital murder cases, we make ourselves available to minister to families of murder victims. The crimes are horrible. The crimes are heinous. The agony of the families that are left behind is absolutely unbearable. And so there's no question about that. When I look to the biblical record, you were quoting from Genesis 9:6. Yeah. And again, the question is, was this a command by God that we must take a life when somebody takes a life? And as we look at Genesis 9:6, which is considered the Noahic code, or the blessing of Noah, it's when he first comes off and hears God speaking, there are other elements in there that are also part of that we don't consider to be commands. Like, for example, the command that anybody who eats raw meat should be executed, or that an animal that is responsible for a human being dying needs to be executed. We look at those and we see those as part of a poetic text. We don't interpret those as absolute commands. And so when I look at that, I ask myself, why do we take one verse and then the other verses right next to it in the same dialogue? We say, well, that's not a command. So I say, what did God do? What did God do with the first murderer who we would consider a death row murderer, meets all the criteria in terms of first-degree murder, premeditated,
And God was the
all the aggravators.
witness.
What did God do with him?
Well,
Did he do something different, or did he do what he did with Cain? And of course, that's Moses. In Exodus 2:12, we have Moses coming upon an Egyptian overseer, which is a law enforcement officer. He was the representative of Pharaoh to make sure that these people were doing the work for Pharaoh. He comes upon him and sees him beating a Hebrew slave. Moses kills the Egyptian overseer who's performing his legal functions. Then he buries the body. And Exodus even tells us that before killing the overseer, Moses looks this way and that.
He didn't look up.
Premeditation. So we have premeditation, we have killing of a law enforcement officer, and we have covering up the crime after the fact. Most any death penalty state in the United States, Moses is on death row. Did God require Moses to be executed under Genesis 9:6, or did he do what he did with Cain? And of course, we know that God required Moses to go into exile in Midian with Jethro and the sheep.
For 40 years.
In those days, exile was where you put the bad person outside the city because the good people were all in the city. Exile today is where you put the bad people inside the walls because we've taken up all the rest of the area. Biblical exile, I've come to the conclusion, is prison. And so when I look at Genesis 9:6, it doesn't give me a pat answer that God requires us to take the life of a murderer. It gives me more questions as to, do I have to do this to satisfy God? Because if God doesn't require this, why would I take the risk of executing an innocent person if God doesn't require it? And so that was how I found myself working through those passages. You also mentioned Romans 13:4. And Romans 13:4 is fascinating because the two key words in English are the sword, which you mentioned, and execute, to execute justice, which is what's used in the King James. Other translations use carry out, perform, accomplish. In the King James, it's execute. Well, the first thing about the sword is, you and I, in our day and age, we know the difference between a handgun and an Uzi. Those might both be described by the word gun, but we know the difference. Well, there were different words in the Greek to describe what we would call a sword. The word that described the sword that was used for capital punishment, which was beheading, that's where the term capital comes from, the head, is not the word that's used in the Greek in Exodus 13:4. The word that's used in the Greek is the Greek word for a dagger that's worn on the belt, which was frequently used as a utility knife or was used when one was traveling in case somebody jumped you. You could use it for self-defense at close range. It also was well accepted in Koinonia Greek as a symbol for judicial authority. The next word is execute. And when you go to the Greek scriptures for that passage, there's no verb in that part of the sentence. That's why in most King James Bibles, in Romans 13:4, the word execute is in italics because the word doesn't appear in the Greek as a verb. It had to be inserted by the translators for the sentence to make sense in English. Well, one of the definitions of execute is to carry out, to perform. And so if one looks at that, it's possible that Romans 13:4 is telling us that government has the authority to wield judicial justice to carry out God's vengeance on those who reap evil. That means we're not being required to use capital punishment to satisfy God. We're being required to punish crime, which all of us as Christians agree on is extremely important. So that is what I've come to with my studies over these years.
Very good. I guess obviously the carrying out of justice still could be also for the punishment of evildoers. It still is for the punishment of evildoers.
Yes.
So, and governments, which this is a hard pill to swallow. Throughout history, that existed through God's sovereignty, were there through His sovereignty, and He allowed nations to rise and to fall. And within that government structure, even though evils were carried out, executions happened all the time. Is that correct?
Well, governments have done a lot of things that God didn't require.
Right.
And executions may well be one of those.
Yeah.
The sovereignty of God through government to maintain what we call the common good. I don't believe, I've come to the conclusion, it's not in any way diminished or challenged by removing from government the power to kill people. There's still the power to imprison them and to protect society.
We understand that part. What about for treason?
In which sense?
For the execution, for high treason. Does our Constitution allow for the execution for treason?
It has been so long that I have not looked at it as a legal issue. I believe the last people sentenced to death for treason, it was under espionage, and that may have been in connection with the atomic bomb design.
Yeah, I think
it may have been
the
the Rosenbergs.
Yeah.
And even there, evidence may have come out that is questioning whether or not they in fact were the people that were responsible for the leak, or whether they were just easy to use as scapegoats.
And that being said, that could possibly be. There's a lot of ifs and a lot of questions that are going on in higher places that I can't even walk in their shadows. I get it. And sometimes you wonder if you're really getting the full truth. And that really is a problem when it comes to these big crimes or the things that the general public is led to believe on certain things, such as the Rosenbergs. If they actually did commit the crime, if they actually did it, does the Constitution provide for their execution?
I don't know if it's in the Constitution or if it's in a statute of Congress. One of the questions that comes up all the time is terrorism. Well, that's in the jurisdiction of the federal government. And there's been so few federal executions. Many federal prosecutors have stopped bringing death penalty cases, usually for ordinary crimes like drug cartels and things of that nature, because they can't get death sentences. People say, let's put them in prison for the rest of their life. And so there's been so few federal executions that it's hard to keep track of exactly what the legal authority is for a particular reason. But the question always comes back to this. How do you and I respond to horrible crimes? Do I respond based on what the person did, which was so horrible and so beneath everything I believe? Or do I respond based on what I believe? Do I choose not to let the person who's committed this heinous crime bring me down to that level by killing in return, and choose instead to respond based on where I stand in faith? And I've come to the conclusion that that is the response I want to make. And if God doesn't require me to kill somebody who's already captured, in prison, rendered harmless, and incapable of doing further harm, if God doesn't require me to kill him or her, then why would I do that? That's not what I believe. That's not what I stand for.
Right.
And so I would rather
On an
leave people in prison.
On an individual basis, obviously, that you have, I think of Stephen, who was one of the first martyrs, and probably the first martyr other than the Lord himself, but he was in the New Testament, where he was being stoned, and he said, Lord, forgive them, for they know not what they do.
Yes.
And it was actually the Apostle Paul that was actually doing the stoning.
Powerful.
And there was this this call for forgiveness on an individual level. We get that. And of course, Paul got the letters from to go out and take these people and kill them, which is a contradiction in itself.
And that's an interesting that you bring that up, Kevin, because that's a crucial thing we forget. When we look at a passage like Romans 13:4, it wasn't written about Christians doing the executions. It was written about Christians being like Stephen and accepting it for the sake of the gospel. It was on the other end. It's only later, centuries later, that we find Christians struggling with Romans 13:4 with the Christians in power. And that's a whole, I mean, we don't even have time to go into that analysis.
Real quickly, on the percentage, how many people have actually been exonerated who have been on death row?
Oh my gosh. In Florida, we've had 25 people come off death row innocent. That's one for every 3 executions.
And recently in Massachusetts, we've seen that there was a lady who was actually fudging the DNA, where people were actually sentenced to crimes. Some may be on death row, some may be lifers. But there's a problem with our justice system to actually reach justice when there's corruption in our justice system. And there is. There's no doubt. It's humanity. Everybody is capable of doing it. And this always puts that big question mark in your mind. You know, something that rings true is I watched that movie, The Green Mile, probably a dozen times. Probably a dozen times. And obviously it's fictitious, but it always brings that question. Boy, there was a good man that was executed. And does it happen? We know it's happened. It has to have happened.
Our own Supreme Court justices are saying, of course, it will happen.
And that being said, that is an injustice in itself, and somebody guilty goes away. So I look forward to, we're going to be meeting this coming Wednesday, so I look forward to listening. I know there are a couple of books that you have, Now I Walk on Death Row, instead of, and it just brings to mind, Now I Lay Me Down to Sleep. Well, this is kind of a play on that. And you wrote another book called The Biblical Truth about America's death penalty. And I look forward to reading these, and I promise I will. I will read these. You can get these on Amazon, Doc?
Yes, they're both available on Amazon. The Now I Walk on Death Row book is available on Kindle.
Okay.
The other book is not on Kindle. It's only in hard copy.
Interesting. And how long are you going to be in the state?
A couple of days.
Couple of days.
Here to share experiences and to allow people through me to find out what the death penalty is like up close, how it affects staff, how it affects the families of the murder victims, how it affects the families of the condemned, how it affects people who are doing what I'm doing. What I tell people is the death penalty leaves no survivors. The death penalty up close harms everybody it touches, and it gives us nothing. But I enflesh that with the stories that allows them to come to that conclusion themselves.
And that's in these books?
These stories are in the short book. The first book is a scholarly book on the actual biblical death penalty and how it cannot be used to support the death penalty we have in the United States.
And with that, we'll close the show. And I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you. I appreciate the conversation. Well, there you have it. There's, there's questions. Some people on the biblical side will say it's biblical. Some will say, well, it's not biblical. And then we have a justice system. Can we trust our justice system to carry out something that we're divided on as well, where there's mistakes, where there's intentional mistakes or withholding of evidence? There's a lot of questions, but justice must be served. But how is that carried out? We'll be continuing to talk about this for some time, I'm sure. Until next week, thanks for watching Speak Up. We'll see you.
The preceding program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.